Most people are looking at the wrong moment. They think the big moment was when American Commandos came down on ropes and took another Iranian-linked tanker. It was dramatic, it was clean, it was the kind of footage that makes people feel like one side is clearly in control. I do not think that was the real moment. The real moment was the ease of it, the speed, the confidence, the fact that another ship could be stopped, boarded, and folded into a pattern so quickly that it already felt like routine. Because once something this serious begins to feel routine, you are no longer looking at an isolated military action. You are looking at a conflict that is becoming organized, repeatable, and easier to expand. That is what jumped out at me when I read this source on the 23rd of April. The United States sees another sanctioned stateless vessel, Majestic X, linked to Iranian oil movement in the Indian Ocean. The source ties it directly into a larger chain. There had already been other ship actions in the previous days. One earlier vessel had its engine room hit before a boarding team went in. Another had already been interdicted. The point of recounting the earlier operations is obvious. This is not being presented as a one-off. It is being presented as a campaign rhythm. And campaign rhythm is what should scare you. I have spent my life watching how systems behave under pressure. In markets, when one extraordinary move works, people try it again. When it works again, they build process around it. In politics and war, the pattern is no different. A first action is a test. A second action is reinforcement. By the third, the action begins to define the new normal. That is where we are heading. The source also makes clear that Iran is not passive in this picture. The Strait of Hormuz is reportedly being mined further. Iranian commandos are boarding ships as well. Washington is sending one message, Tehran is sending another. America is saying we can reach your fleet, cut your revenue, and police the maritime space. Iran is saying we can still poison the corridor, still create fear, still make every passage uncertain. Neither message cancels the other. Together, they create the most dangerous condition of all. A battlefield where both sides still believe they have leverage. That is when wars widen. Not when one side is obviously beaten, not when one side has no options left. Wars widen when both sides can still point to a real instrument of pain and tell themselves the next move may improve their position. America has ship seizures, carriers, airlift, and air cover. Iran has mines, boardings, disruption, and the ability to turn water into risk. Each side can still convince itself it has another card to play. And human beings are very dangerous when they still think the next card might change everything. The carrier angle in this document is not a side note. It is the skeleton key. You have Lincoln already in the region. You have Ford positioned with responsibilities tied to maritime threats around Yemen. You have George H.W. Bush closing distance with calculations about how fast it can arrive depending on speed. People see a carrier and think spectacle. I see logistics, rotation, sortie depth, political signaling, and endurance. One carrier can intimidate. Multiple carriers can normalize ongoing force. 3 carriers tell me Washington wants to be ready for a phase that lasts, that matters. Because the source says something else that should not be missed around. The clock flights continue. The airlift is not stopping. It is building. In other words, this is not merely muscle flexing for cameras. Assets are being arranged, sustained, and layered. That means planners are thinking beyond tonight. They are thinking about what they may need if this becomes a heavier campaign. If the shipping war expands, or if political leadership decides that limited enforcement is no longer enough. Here's the line I would underline if I were trying to explain the entire situation in one sentence. The war has not fully restarted, but everything that makes a restarted war easier is being put in place. That is the sentence hiding inside this whole document. Another thing people miss is that footage is part of the weapon. Now the helicopters, the boarding teams, the public language about denying illicit actors freedom of maneuver, the replaying of earlier seizures, even the discussion around warning flares and military blockade language, all of it does operational work and psychological work at the same time. It pressures captains, it pressures networks, it pressures buyers, it pressures anyone who thought ambiguity could keep them safe. A shadow fleet survives on the belief that enforcement will be inconsistent. Delayed or negotiable public boarding footage destroys part of that belief. But here is where the story turns darker. Iran learns from footage too. Tehran watches what America boards, how America boards, what America publicizes, where America concentrates force, and how much political appetite exists for keeping that force there. And in response, Iran does what weaker but still dangerous actors often do. It looks for ways not to win the war outright, but to make the enforcement architecture expensive, messy, and psychologically unfinished. Mines do that, opportunistic boardings do that, persistent ambiguity does that. A corridor does not have to be fully closed to become strategically contaminated. It only has to become uncertain enough that every transit carries fear. That is why I do not think this is really a story about a tanker. It is a story about contamination. Not contamination in the chemical sense, contamination in the strategic sense, the sea lane, the rules, the cost assumptions, the timelines, the expectations of what counts as normal passage. All of that is being contaminated by recurring force. Once that happens, even successful enforcement can fail to produce stability, because every success invites an answer somewhere else in the system. The source even hints at that larger answer without needing to say it directly. If carrier power rises, Iran has reason to thicken the maritime threat. If Iranian disruption rises, Washington has reason to justify more sustained deployment. If deployments deepen, every state watching the region starts making its own calculations about hedging, endurance, insurance, procurement, and alignment. A ship seizure is never just a ship seizure, once everybody believes it belongs to a sequence. And sequence is what changes history. People ask when a crisis crosses the line. I usually think they are asking the question too late. The line is rarely crossed in one leap. Usually, the line is crossed quietly when the actors involved stop behaving like this. Is temporary. That is the real indicator. Are they improvising, or are they building? Are they reacting, or are they organizing? In this document, I see organizing. I see ship seizures being integrated into message discipline. I see carrier movement being integrated into theater geometry. I see airlift being integrated into sustained readiness. I see Iranian disruption being integrated into a strategy of constant friction. That is not improvisation, that is architecture, and architecture is hard to reverse. If I were telling this story the way I think Warren Buffett would tell a room full of serious people, I would say the biggest money is often made by understanding what phase you are in before the crowd does. The same principle applies to geopolitical risk. If you think you are still in the phase of sporadic incidents, you will underestimate what comes next. If you realize you are entering the phase of structured escalation, you stop asking whether the latest video was exciting and start asking what kind of system is being built underneath it. That is the question that matters. Now, what kind of system is being built? A system where sanctioned ships can be plucked out one by one. A system where Iran can answer not with symmetrical naval power, but with enough instability to keep the water dangerous. A system where each seizure justifies another deployment. A system where each mine justifies another patrol. A system where every day without full war still looks a little more like preparation for it. That is why I find the calm tone of routine military updates almost eerie. In moments like this, they can make an acceleration sound administrative, another vessel, another boarding, another deployment, another set of photos from the flight deck, another day of flights, another radio intercept, another measured statement piece by piece. The language dulls the public's sensitivity to just how abnormal the baseline has become. But the baseline is not normal. A fresh tanker seizure, additional Iranian mining counterboardings, multiple American carriers aligned around the same theater. This is not stability. This is a machine being assembled in public. And once a machine like that is assembled, leaders become tempted to use the capacity they paid to build. That is why I would watch the next steps very carefully. Not just whether another ship gets stopped. Watch how Washington describes the mission after the next ship gets stopped. Watch whether the language shifts from enforcement toward denial, from interdiction toward campaign, from temporary action toward continuing posture. Watch whether Tehran answers with another direct maritime move or something designed to make the corridor feel permanently unsafe. Watch whether the Bush closes the gap and how officials speak once that force package is complete. Because by then, the question may no longer be whether the war is restarting. The question may be whether the region has already accepted a new operating reality in which restart is only a matter of timing. That is the danger here. Not simply that men with rifles boarded a tanker. The danger is that everybody involved is beginning to act like this. Can keep happening. And when enough powerful people start acting as if something can keep happening, sooner or later, it usually does.